Welcome. After a devastating debt crisis, Greece now has to manage the economic impacts of the COVID pandemic. Having returned to economic growth in 2018, its path is now subject to a new uncertainty. My colleague, Professor Sir Christopher Pissarides, was tasked by the new Greek government to bring forward a new development plan for the country. The committee is independent of the government. It is composed of some of the most senior Greek economists. It published its interim report in the summer, and just in recent days, it has submitted its full report to the Prime Minister. The committee's report is not to be binding on the government, rather it is to propose a framework and a set of priority actions. In our discussion this afternoon, I'm going to invite Chris to present the committee's main recommendations. Chris is well known to many of you. He is the Regius Professor of Economics at the LSE. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2010 and has received many awards, not least from Cyprus, his homeland, and the UK, his location of adoption. Following Chris's presentation, I'll be very pleased to invite responses from Professor Louka Katseli and Professor Michalis Haliassos. Louka will also be known to many of you, as she has combined an impressive academic career and a political career, alongside a banking and international career. Earlier this year, she published her very interesting memoirs of her time in government. Michalis is Professor of Macroeconomics and Finance at the Goethe Institute in Frankfurt. He is a senior member of the CEPR network and an advisor to the European Central Bank. He was also a leader of the Greek Economists for Reform group. His work has been widely commended. Our discussion today is being live streamed on Facebook, and in a few days' time, it will be available as a podcast to download from the LSE's Hellenic Observatory website. We invite you, our audience, to follow us on Twitter using the hashtag LSE Greece, and you can also send us your questions at any time using the Q&A facility at the bottom of your Zoom screen or using the comment facility on Facebook. Today's discussion is being co-hosted by the LSE's Hellenic Observatory and the Hellenic Association of Entrepreneurs. And we are very pleased to be working together on this matter of great public importance. Let me now pass over to the association's president, Dr. Vasilis Apostolopoulos, for him to say a few words. Vasilis will then be followed by Chris Pissarides. Vasilis.
Honorable Professor Sir Pissarides, dear Professor Featherstone, dear Professors Katseli and Haliassos, distinguished guests. It is with great honor that I'm welcoming you all here today in my capacity as President of the Hellenic Entrepreneurs Association, co-hosting this event. And also, it is with great joy that I welcome all LSE alumni joining us today in my fresh role as President of the LSE Hellenic Alumni Association. And I cannot but thank from this prestigious and highly symbolic podium very warmly all the alumni body for their support and trust. The hard work begins as of today, and the deepening of our cooperation with the university, its departments, and especially the Hellenic Observatory will be a top priority. Professor Sir Pissarides, it is a unique privilege having you with us today in this timely event and critical discussion for the future of Greece. As head of the committee for the new growth plan for Greece, you have already contributed decisively to the national debate regarding the necessary changes in our productive model. At the Hellenic Entrepreneurs Association, we immediately welcomed the findings and recommendation of the committee's interim report in July, downloading important points in our agenda to help inform and enrich our institutional dialogue with the Greek political and economic leadership. We particularly welcomed the tailored recommendations of the report for the strengthening of productivity and extroversion of the Hellenic entrepreneurship, and especially the emphasis the committee places on strengthening the connection between technology and innovation. Our association organized this year more than 10 workshops focusing on practical ways to boost innovation and encourage the adoption of more technology-intensive production and manufacturing methods, not just in the heavy industries and high-tech, but also in the primary sector, where agrotech can be a game changer in the Greek ecosystem, a fast-forward industry 4.0 and agriculture 4.0. We have also worked to highlight the role of innovation in startup and mature entrepreneurship, as well as the key role that innovation and entrepreneurial clusters can play in terms of catalyzing growth. We concur with the interim report that a smart reindustrialization with an emphasis in high value added manufacturing and production is a core priority for a less crisis-prone economy and a more sustainable new productive model. Additionally, we place emphasis on the tremendous added value and growth potential that can be unlocked through a systematic scaling up of the Hellenic entrepreneurship. Bigger firms, as aptly suggested in the report, are in a better position to invest and innovate and invest in R&D. I would moreover summarily add that large firms are key pillars in any business ecosystem, contributing to the national competitiveness and economic stability. They are less susceptible to tax evasion. They decisively contribute to employment, offering good and stable jobs, and also they have proven to be pillars of stability in times of crisis. Lastly, and crucially, they are contributing to a positive change in the entrepreneurial culture, enhancing key values such as good corporate governance and corporate social responsibility, as well as sustainability, euphoria, and excellence. The report also includes a series of excellent recommendations for the microeconomic and structural reforms that will unlock productivity, enhance economic and business competitiveness, and will help the foundations for an enduring stable growth. We are very much looking forward to the complete report, Professor. You are making a great contribution to the Greek state and the economy. Honorable Chair, dear Professor Featherstone, I would like to conclude with an optimistic note. After what has become now an 11-year polycrisis, a unique window of opportunity is being delineated. I am referring to the approximately 72 billion euros of combined recovery and growth funds that have been earmarked for Greece over the next 7 years. I have called it the other side of the hill and can be transformed with the right proactive actions by the state and our business community, of course, into a historic opportunity for Greece. A smart model is needed for the investment of these funds, with delivery mechanisms that are simple, transparent, straightforward, and swift. The key idea that I recommend is the following. We leave the first agency to the private sector. The entrepreneur takes the risks. Design and develop a solid business plan, a viable venture. And on that basis, the state comes and channels state and EU funds as pure investment fuel. In the past, business plans were developed in Greece with a view to get access to public funding. Well, I say, it's high time to kill the pathogenicity of the past and finally change the chessboard. Encourage entrepreneurs to begin formulating straight away their growth strategies, sketch out their projects, and begin composing their business plans under the broad umbrella of priorities that have been highlighted as the key priorities for the change of our productive model. In other words, I suggest that we agree to say to the Greek business community that the ball is in your court and encourage proposals that fall within the key growth axes discussed. Then fuel the growth of these plans, encouraging positive change in the ecosystems and allowing for a series of lighthouse projects to sign, inspiring others to emulate. I look forward to the interesting discussion and conclusions. I will now pass on the floor, or shall I say the screen, to Sir Pissarides. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Apostolopoulos, and thank you especially for your very kind comments, words about our interim report, which came out last July. We're looking forward to see the applications of that and seeing the result of the efforts that you've just described. I would also like to thank the Hellenic Observatory and the Hellenic Association of Entrepreneurs as a body for hosting this meeting. I look forward to the discussion, and I should say that it's small correction, if I might say, to what Kevin Thurston was saying. It's not an official summary of the report, which hasn't been quite made public yet, but they're my suggestions of what I consider to be the leading types of reforms that should be adopted by Greece over the next 5 years, if not beyond. And in that, of course, I was helped enormously by Nikos Vetas, the vice chair of the committee, who is at the University of Athens, of the Economic University of Athens, and the head of Iovea, and Dimitri Vayanos of the London School of Economics, and Kostas Megier of Yale University, as well as several consultants and other members of the Greek society that they very kindly agreed to give time to us and talk. Now, in my talk, I will share some slides with you that make bullet points, and I will follow them more or less there. They're a little bit more wordy than I thought, and I hope you listen to the commentary as well as reading. For some reason, the sharing is not quite coming up. Let's give it another try. Of course, these things, when you try them before, they work in an instant. When you try them on the day, they take their time. Unlike theater people who say it will be all right on the day, when it comes to slide sharing on Zoom, it was all right on the trial. Here we are. Here we start. That's my title. It's about the new economic plan for Greece. Now, as background, well, you know it all, but I'd just like to mention it. Over the last few years, Greece, you could describe it as a poor relation, as the sick man of Europe, quote unquote, if you like, compared with the old members of the European Union, of course, because for many years it's been on the bottom rankings in economic performance, business, environment, education, tax compliance, public debt, physical environment, and so on. In fact, Greece might consider themselves to be lucky that Cyprus, my birthplace, as you might know, is listed as a separate member of the European Union, because it keeps a good company down there. And of course, what I'm going to say, Cyprus needs these reforms too, but let us see. Now, when we talk about reforms in Greece, people are saying, but so many reforms have taken place in Greece. What new are you going to say to us? Well, the reforms before, they were in response to the memoranda, MOUs, but their impact has been very small, although a lot has taken place. The previous governments managed to balance the budget, which of course was an essential requirement. It's very good, but that has been reversed by COVID-19. But as was mentioned in the introduction, there is now more EU money that will cover all those debts. Now, there are many people, when I talk to, especially in Britain, in Europe, when I go to Brussels, of course, not officially, but they might say, you know, Greece is unreformable. You know, it's reached a point where it's culture, it's a failed state. Is there any hope? Well, I take strong exception to that. I believe that the potential for Greece is huge. If you compare Greece as a small country within the European Union with other small countries of the European Union, Greece comes out on an advantage if you look at the small parts, take them separately. It's when you put everything together that it doesn't seem to work in the way it works for Northern European countries. It's a country with loads of natural resources, Greece, but they're extracted and not processed in Greece. Even olives are collected in Greek olive groves and sent to Italy to be marketed as olive oil. There is a large potential for renewable energy production because there are lots of uninhabited islands with lots of sunshine and lots of wind. It stands between the Balkans, Europe, Asia, Middle East, and already the Chinese are using Piraeus as a port of entry into Europe. There is a lot more that can be done there. They do have entrepreneurial spirit, as Mr. Apostolopoulos knows even better than me, and he emphasized it, and that could be exploited for the economic good of the country. And it is a socially liberal population. You don't have the sort of social constraints and things that other countries have might hold it back. Of course, I don't need to tell you about the cultural heritage and the natural beauty. We have all enjoyed both, as the majority of Europeans at least have done. And therefore, I'd say that there is an enormous future to Greek economic development. The main challenge is how to unleash this potential. And this is what we're trying to do. Now, you might say, why did they fail so much in the past? Well, I think that the reason is fairly simple. So reforms succeed when they are owned by someone. That you are doing the reforms not because someone else has told you do the reforms, but because you believe that it's going to be good for you. And past governments haven't owned the reforms. It was more piecemeal in two minds. Yes, maybe this, maybe that, and we'll do the other. And I mean, the most typical statement that highlights what I've just said is just after the referendum, I think it was 2016 maybe, that the Tsipras government ran, which was a no vote, and then he wisely, I would say, in fact, changed, and he said, we're going to follow the MOUs. He said, yes, we're going to reform, not because we agree, but because it's better than the alternative. That's a typical case of non-ownership. The piecemeal approach leads to what we call in economics, at least, the O-ring type of failure, which, of course, it goes back to the 1980s with the space shuttle, where extremely sophisticated technology or failed, exploded, killed the astronauts, the passengers, because some small part of the whole structure, the O-rings, failed. And this is what we've been observing in Greece. There is some bottleneck somewhere that stops the potentially important reform. As a result, what I think is needed for Greece is an all-encompassing reforms, that they should include pure economic reforms, like I'm going to tell you in a minute, about productivity, investment. They should also have administrative reforms. The administration of justice, for example, needs to be reformed. And we need social reforms, which is support for poverty, the famous European social state, which I hope we never abandoned. Importantly, these reforms are complementary. For example, one big reform in our in the suggestions, in which I believe very strongly as labor economist at least, and not only as a human being, I should say, as a Greek, is that there should be more active involvement of women in the Greek labor force. There should be not incentives, which would be good. There shouldn't be barriers to their entry into the labor force. Now there are barriers. And what is needed there to encourage more women coming into the labor force, which you might regard as an economic reform, it's like an increase in the supply of labor, I can put it in economic terminology. You need social policy, childcare support, for example. So there is complementarity between these two types of reforms, and those should be done together. So because of that, because of what I said, that it's got to be a holistic approach, and it's got to be, and reforms are complementary and put together, it's very important that no one should ask, if I could do only a small number X for reforms, say 5 reforms, which ones would it be? That's not the right question, and therefore, it doesn't have an answer. Don't ever ask me, if you could choose 3 or 4 of your reforms, which one would you do? I think it's going to fail, because that happened before. It's a system that we have to follow. Not a little bit here, a little bit there. Now, let me begin to say something about economic reforms. And the question here that I want to ask myself, is there a single most important feature of the poor economic performance of Greece that drags everything down, that doesn't allow that potential to be unleashed that I mentioned before. And the answer, I believe, is yes, within the sort of economic uncertainties, obviously, that we have. But I would like to highlight, that's why I put the blue highlight, because blue is the color of Greece, of course. It's the low productivity that is plaguing, if you like, if such a word exists, the Greek economy. Low productivity makes Greek industry uncompetitive. It cannot compete with other European industry, and it does live in a single European market. As a result, Greek industry exports less. Its exports are very, very low, much below Portugal, for example, and other countries of similar size, if not stable economic development. Exports, we believe, are essential if companies have to grow and reap economies of scale. You do need bigger economic units in Greece, but you cannot have them in this small market that is Greece. Market size is important for modern technology and modern industry. And to achieve that market size, you need more exports. To achieve those exports, you need high productivity. Once you don't have the high productivity, everything else down that line fails. And that gives rise to a vicious circle. There is uncompetitive Greek industry, is stuck in the small domestic market. This domestic market in recent years has been made even smaller by high debt levels, high taxes, low wages, non-performing loans, so banks cannot contribute, and so on. Because of this, Greek industry fails to attract investment. Who go and invest, especially from abroad? Abroad, they don't come to invest because productivity is low. Domestically, there isn't enough money to invest. There aren't enough deposits into banks. And without investment, companies miss out on new technology. You need large companies with lots of investment to take advantage of new technology. Country remains low productivity and uncompetitive. And you're into this vicious circle that low productivity causes even lower productivity in the future, at least lower growth than elsewhere. Now, you cannot succeed if you don't break this vicious circle somehow. It can just go round and round. Small companies, more or less what we've observing over the last 10 years or so. Now, there is a certain sequence you can follow of reforms, in the sense that a certain kind of reform would be more successful, you have a bigger impact if another complementary reform is done either at the same time or just before. But that's not a reason for delaying any reform. Just get into it and do any reform that it's possible to do, given costs and feasibilities and studies, but do respect the complementarity of reform, that to place one before another if the other will have a higher rate of return given the first one. Reforms reinforce each other, as several academic papers have written, have published. Now, given the vicious circle I described between productivity, exports, and company size, I identify the weakest link and attack that one to strengthen the links that I mentioned. So what's the weakest link in that vicious circle that is causing you to remain down there? And I believe that's the poor investment performance of Greece. Current investment performance is about 12% of GDP. It's the lowest in Europe. Comparable countries have 20 to 25%, twice as much. No country can renew its capital stock, innovate, and get new technology with 12% investment. In economics, when we want to simulate or calibrate an economy and we need to use a depreciation of capital stock, how much of the capital stock needs to be renewed every year just to maintain the same level, we usually assume about 10%. So essentially, Greek investment, what it's succeeding to do is to maintain the capital stock at the very low levels and low technology levels that pre-existed. The domestic supply of funds is low. Banks cannot lend much, especially on speculative investment ventures. And therefore, it becomes very important to attract foreign direct investment, foreign investors coming into Greece, to break this vicious circle I described, to lead to more investment, more productivity, and let companies grow. Now, once we have the investment, then that will improve, or let me put it differently, once the investment environment of the country improves and that attracts investors, there will be higher returns, better advantages, comparative advantages, if you like, in other reforms. You can then get the larger labor supply, especially more women, more youths coming into the labor market, because more investment means you're creating more jobs. There will be jobs for them to take. The incentives for better education are there and better training. Companies will be able to train because they're going to have the money. People, men and women, will be more willing to go into education and train because they know that there will be jobs where they can take advantage of their education. You innovate more with new investment, you have bigger companies, more exports, economies of scale from those, and you're going to have enough money for even better social support, because social support in Greece is behind many Europeans, and I'm not just talking about the Scandinavians where they talk of Europe, I'm also talking about Central Europeans. So that's the sort of challenge, if you like. You get your more investment and all these other things follow, and you get more higher employment, better technology, higher productivity, higher wages, and so on. Now, how do we get there? How do we create a better investment environment? We create it by some big picture reforms that break the barriers to economic development that are present in Greece, and so many growth theorists have written about it in the economics literature. We need public sector reform, simpler bureaucracy, digitalization of services, speedier decisions, both from regulators and especially the courts. You cannot have a modern economy functioning if some economic dispute has to wait for 6-7 years for decision or whatever, however long it might take. We need to improve the competition in product markets first by breaking up monopolies and abolishing other rent-seeking opportunities. Restriction here, restriction there, a lot of regulation that creates opportunity. The polite way of describing is rent-seeking in economics. The not so polite way of describing it is corruption, basically. Reduce the non-wage costs of salaried employment that mainly come from the tax system, so that employers can take on more people. Because the best way to help a person who is without a job is not by giving transfers that will maintain some very low standard of living, but it's by providing a job. And the job is provided by the company that is going to create that job vacancy, and it's going to attract the person. And with the higher investment, wages will be higher because productivity will be higher. But now non-wage costs of salaried employment are so high in Greece that many people simply choose to go into self-employment because jobs are not opening in companies. And the self-employment sector in Greece is extremely low productivity. It's the one that is dragging down, in fact, the rest of the economy. Now, other reforms to encourage investment, accelerate red tape reduction for companies, make their accounts or regulations simpler, tax reform to reduce the tax wage. I just mentioned this, in fact, the tax burden on salary work, better protection of investors' rights, property rights, and quick decisions from the courts to resolve any disputes, faster reduction on non-performing loans and incentives for more bank deposits so that there would be a supply of funds for investment. Electronic payment systems are essential. Most of Europe is adopting them by now. And taxes, so give tax incentives to companies for the digitalization of their activities. And of course, with the environment, give incentives for the greening of buildings, by which we mean changes in the structure of buildings, in the way they're heated, in the way you insulate the walls. There are labor-intensive activities. Once that starts, which is part of the European Green Deal anyway, more jobs would be created because you cannot get robots to that kind of job. It's human beings that have to do them. Now, what about labor market reforms that I said are needed for more employment? Labor market and education reforms will increase the supply of labor and the quality of human capital. We need to start education from preschool. That includes both childcare and learning. Modern theories of education show that preschool learning has the highest rate of return for the rest of one's life. And Greece doesn't have any of those. We need to introduce paternity leave as well as maternity leave, treat father and mother equally on how long they take out of work to look after young children and how they are treated once they enter the labor market. There are anti-discrimination laws, apply them with immediate effect, much stricter, so that there is no discrimination against one gender, in favor of another, and we know which gender will get discriminated if there is such a discrimination. School infrastructures need to be improved. Evaluation of teacher performance and school performance are absolutely essential. That was applied here in Britain about 30 years ago, and it transformed schools completely to evaluate how well they're doing and reward the good performance and take measures to improve the performance of the ones that are left behind. Now, what about higher education? Well, universities should have more independence because that way they have better incentives for research. Now they're controlled too much by the Ministry of Education. Set up an independent council for competitive research funding, like the National Science Foundation in the United States, the ESRC in Britain. The European Research Council, of course, is a wonderful addition to the European community, but we need a domestic one as well as the European one. Give tax incentives to companies for research, put more emphasis on manufacturing, as it was mentioned just before. The manufacturing sector in Greece is extremely low, it's extremely small. For a country at the level of economic development of Greece, manufacturing needs to be higher, it needs to be to occupy a bigger fraction of the labor force. But to achieve those, of course, you do need to have more exports and bigger companies. The lower levels of Greek manufacturing now are ones that can be justified only by countries that are far more advanced on the service side of the economy than Greece is, countries like Netherlands or Denmark, for example. Now, agricultural products. Greece has wonderful reputation in its agricultural products. Everyone who visits Greece comes back and says, oh, wonderful food, what vegetables, wonderful taste and all that. But we don't have the made in Greece or produced in Greece as an international brand name for agricultural products. We do have yogurt and feta, or feta cheese, as they say in English, which are known, but there is no reason why Greece shouldn't have a branding of made in Greece the way that Italy has. You know, you go anywhere in the world, China, America, anywhere you want, and they say, this is Italian, it's good. When referring to agricultural products, this is Italian olive oil, or this is Italian mozzarella, or whatever. There is no reason why Greece shouldn't have the same. It's smaller, of course, but reputations don't depend on size. They depend on quality. Increase collaborations between industry and universities. That's absolutely essential for modern technologies. Look at Silicon Valley. Look at the collaboration between industry and universities in Germany, which is even higher than the United States, actually. It doesn't have a Silicon Valley, high-profile Silicon Valley, but it quietly sort of gets on with the job. And of course, there is a Greek diaspora. Everywhere you go, you hear Greek names. The current CEO of Pfizer, you may have heard, that discovered this coronavirus vaccine is of the Greek diaspora. And this is a parenthetic remark. He's been working very closely with the Turkish head of BioNTech, who was changed, what will change the work, hopefully, with the pandemic. But what I'm saying is that there is a great diaspora, not only universities, but also heads of big companies that could help a lot. Now, what about the social state? As I was mentioning, don't forget the social state. We need more social support in Greece. European welfare state, social state is one of the reasons that I was never tempted to go to the United States and work, stay in Europe. And alongside the labor market reforms, we should be upgrading our social support mechanisms, health system, introduce electronic medical records, more independence for hospitals, just as we have for universities, evaluations of costs and performance of hospitals, and see what can be done for those who are too costly to operate. Use generic medicines, not branded. All these are improvements that will reduce costs in the medical sector and will help medics concentrate on the important things, which are treating patients. Better support for the unemployed, of course, with retraining options at the end. I mean, the system I'm most fond of is the flexicurity system of Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, where a person is given unconditional transfers for the first 6 months. Say you give lots of support there to look for a job. If they don't find a job, then you interview them, you find out why, you provide training programs then. And those can be very effective in ending durations of unemployment. And of course, whether now Greece has a lot of immigration, that will continue. The whole of Europe will have a lot of immigration. We need special programs for better integration of immigrants, language, culture, work. And of course, people with special needs need to be supported more. They can be productive, they can be supported in the labor force, but they do have special needs. That's the very description tells us so. I'm very close to the end. We need now governance and administrative reforms are equally important. Of course, the public sector reform I mentioned before. Have more independent hiring committees in the public sector, regular evaluations for promotions free of political interference, longer tenure of senior political appointments. Currently there are 3 years, which is not long enough. And there's this peculiarity in Greece as well, that over a 3-year period, you might have someone as your boss because he was appointed by the government, and then over the following 3 years, you might become the boss of that person. So that creates rather peculiar relationships. Before, you don't want to be too bossy towards a junior colleague, because that junior colleague might become your boss immediately after. That could be corrected to a large extent by extending the tenures, at least as long as governments are in power. Now, better training and evaluation of judges to clear the backlog and speed up decisions, especially on economic corporate matters. Hiring of more court assistants, junior judges to help in the work. Extension of the out-of-court settlements to clear the backlog again. And of course, decentralization of several services. It's incredible how centralized Greece is. I mentioned before, more independence for hospitals. Schools should be transferred to local education authorities. Land registry, which doesn't exist yet in Greece, actually, in a highly developed form, should be created, and authorities allocated to the authority allocated to local authorities to arrange for land registrations. There's just too much involvement of the ministries in Athens of things going on in Greece. And that might be why it's becoming such a urbanized, centralized economy as well, with what is about 40% of the population living in Athens and region, when there are such wonderful areas outside where people could live. And finally, public investments in digitalization. We need to digitalize public services, industry. Greece is committed to the UN Sustainable Goals and the EU Green Deal. It's committed to no carbon emissions well, definitely by 2050, but I think it's offered to accelerate to 2030. But in the meantime, I think we have been getting some fines from EU for not keeping up, and at least until recently. Environmental protection is needed badly. It's got a wonderful environment now, but it does need support, more recycling, bigger circular economy, reduce landfill, renewable energy, lots of wind, sun, and inhabited islands, not being taken advantage very much. In fact, Greece could potentially supply most of Europe with wind or sun energy. And now it's being connected with Egypt by Cyprus, in fact. And that will contribute as well to the distribution of energy. So those are essential things that need to be done as part of the of environmental protection in the EU Green Deal. So here's my very last slide now. I promise you Greece needs across-the-board reforms. I outlined several of them. They will not be easy to achieve, of course. Don't think that it's as easy to write a book about reforms as it is to actually put it into practice. But start with reforms that attract investment, outward expansion of companies, more exports, more productivity. That will have huge impact on the overall economy and the overall reform program. Thank you very much for listening to me. I will stop sharing now.
Thank you, Chris, very much indeed. Can we move straight over to Louka Katseli, please?
Sure. Let me put my, okay. Thank you very much. First, let me start by saying a big thank you to the LSE and to the Hellenic Observatory, and Kevin, to you, for making it possible to have this open dialogue on a new economic plan for Greece, something that we all worry about, and we are all looking forward to it. I'll try and start my brief presentation, which should not last more than 10 minutes, on points of agreement with Chris. Yes, Greece is a country of enormous potential. It has infinite natural resources, cultural assets, renewable energy. It's the gateway to Europe, Asia, and Africa. It has an entrepreneurial population and many, many other assets. That's for sure. It's also true that after 10 years of harsh austerity policies and structural reforms, and I've put the structural reforms in quotes, results are disappointing and prospects are uncertain. And Chris before said that the impact of reforms has been small. I'll come back to that because we actually do not know exactly what the impact of reforms has been, as reforms have not been monitored. But there is no doubt that in 2019 at least, GDP per capita in Greece remained low relative to the EU average. The competitiveness of the country, as measured by the current account deficit to the GDP ratio, in other words, its external balance, was a point of concern. We had a deficit of 1.5% as opposed to a surplus of 2.7% in the EU of 27. I would add two more important indicators. One is that the rate of people at risk of poverty after the social transfers was in 2019 30%, as opposed to 21% in the EU. And as Chris already said, investment to GDP ratio remains 10 percentage points lower than the EU average. But let me note that it was 27% above EU average in 2007. Now it's about 12.5. The EU average is 22%. The problem here, let me note, is not so much the investment to GDP ratio, but the composition of investment. As of 2007, investment was high relative to GDP, relative to national income, because of construction and because of household assets. So why the past and present failures? What is the diagnosis? And I think we should start from the diagnosis, because it seems to me that if we're going to make proposals for reforms, we really need to agree on what the problem is. In my view, the cause of poor performance is not the lack of ownership of reforms by Greek governments. The IMF and the Troika proclaimed that this to be the case. And I know that many of my colleagues, including Chris, said that the ownership of reforms is important. Yes, the ownership of reforms is important. But before we ask people to own reforms, we need to ask what kind of reforms. And no government or society can be expected to own a program that consists of harsh austerity policies and a series of structural measures which were more often than not fiscal consolidation measures in disguise. They were called structural reforms, but they were not structural reforms. And many of the policies were ill-designed. They exacerbated the drop in disposable incomes, in unemployment, in over-indebtedness, and inequality. And in my view, it's a miracle that social unrest has been kept at a minimum over the past 12 years, during which most Greek families saw their livelihoods severely affected. So yes, owning reforms is important. There's no doubt about that. But for a society to own the reforms, you need to make sure that these reforms are well designed, they're coherent, and they do not create havoc, as some of the reforms that were introduced did. The other diagnosis that is the fact about, what about low productivity? Yes, low productivity might be low now, and especially during the crisis period. It was not low before 2007. Actually, both total factor productivity and labor productivity was high and growing up to 2007. And the reason is, what we need to think about is, why is productivity low? And what lies behind the recent productivity decline? Well, the question that Chris correctly put, and I want to put as well, is there a single most important cause of poor performance? If we're going to make a diagnosis to guide ourselves as to where to start from, what will we focus on? Well, this reminds me of Albert Hirschman, who is actually an LSE ex-professor, who said in his strategy of economic development in the 50s, late 50s, that underdevelopment occurs not because of lack of capital. Capital can easily be raised. It does not occur because of lack of skilled people, because they can be trained. It occurs because of the failure of a society to organize itself for development. And in my view, this is at the core of the Greek problem. The failure of our society, including both public sector and private sector, to organize ourselves effectively for development. So I would say that the reason why the impact of the reforms, even the well-designed reforms, is low, is because of the low quality of governance, both in the public and private sectors, which I consider to be the Achilles heel of Greek economic and social development. Now, if we accept this as a fundamental reason for the results that we have, we need to go back and say, what is needed for quality of governance to improve? And therefore, where do we start from? Trying to be as practical as I can, I want to suggest what I call a 7-step roadmap to improve the quality of governance and to enhance the impact of reforms in the Greek economy and society. The first step is a credible vision and purpose. Growth is at best a means to an end. It does not provide a vision. It's vision and purpose that give meaning to our collective actions and can mobilize stakeholders. And these are starting points of great companies and countries. If you don't have a vision and you don't have a purpose, then all actions might fail. So if we start with a vision and purpose, we need to think that the world has changed, as correctly was put before, that you need an economic transformation that needs to go hand in hand with social and environmental transformation. And I'll come to the strategy afterwards. But we should not think of an economic plan. We should think of a sustainable plan. So what does this mean for Greece? That we should all map out a national roadmap for prosperity and well-being. It's not an economic project, it's a social project. So let us think about Greece in 2030, in 10 years, and let's try and have a roadmap for prosperity and well-being. Why do I emphasize prosperity and well-being? Because we've seen over the last 2 decades growth taking place in many countries, but inequality is growing as well, poverty growing as well, unemployment growing as well, social unrest growing as well. So let's not think of growth anymore. Let's think of prosperity and well-being. And under prosperity and well-being, I will think of 5 dimensions: human security, decent livelihoods, solidarity and social cohesion, participation, democracy, rights and responsibilities, and the sustainability and the rights of future generations. I think any plan for the future needs to take these aspects into consideration and think much more holistically than a simple economic plan, so that this plan, whatever plan it is, can be sustainable. So a credible vision and purpose needs to be expressed, and this is a political project. The second step is what I consider, given the vision, and is a medium-term sustainable strategy. We need to know how to go from here to there. And thank God in Greece, we can follow Agenda 2030. Agenda 2030 is the agenda that was signed by Greece and by another 192 countries in 2015 at the UN. It is following the UN sustainable goals. All of our countries, including all the European countries, committed to actually implement Agenda 2030 by 2030. And what does Agenda 2030 entails? It entails economic goals, social goals, environmental goals. So we have a strategy which we can follow. Actually, in fact, in 2018, the government issued the first report on the agenda, on the Greek Agenda 2030, and it offers a guide which can be enriched, which can be made much more specific, but I think it's a starting point. And we need this strategy. Why? To mitigate uncertainty by defining roles, tasks, and responsibilities of public, private, and social stakeholders. We need to know who is responsible to do what. To be able to stabilize the regulatory environment which changes from year to year. To introduce, for once, key performance indicators for ministries, for municipalities, for regions, for the private sector, for banks, and committing to realistic timetables for task implementation. Now, investment performance or public services cannot improve when regulation changes continuously, when tax and the regulatory environment changes continuously. I had counted between 2010 to 2015, we had 35 changes in the tax law. There is no way any investor, a national investor or foreign investor, can invest in a country whose tax system changes continuously, and where you cannot tell your accountant, or your accountant cannot tell you what you need to pay over the next years. So we need a medium-term sustainable strategy based on Agenda 2030 that can lead us through in designing policies, which is the third step. Now, these, as Chris correctly said, these policies need to be properly sequenced, but they need also to promote this vision and to be an integral part of this declared strategy. If we take Agenda 2030 as a starting point, fair burden sharing is a prerequisite for ownership. And I think that has been one of the biggest failures that we've had over the past years. Policies that exacerbate inequalities or environmental degradation are not sustainable. We saw it with Macron in France. We saw it in Greece with the exacerbating inequalities. They are not sustainable. They will be reversed sooner or later. The same for stop-go policies, which enhance uncertainty. And one of the reasons why investment is so low is because uncertainty in the Greek environment is extremely high. And last but not least, policy coherence is needed, especially across ministries and across levels of governance, across the EU, the national government, the regional government, and the local government. So if you ask me, what might be if governance is a critical bottleneck which needs to be improved, where will I start from? I would say choose policies that actually will improve governance and produce results sooner rather than later, so that then investment can pick up. Improve regulatory business environment. We started with the licensing with the startup, kind of going from 30 days to 3 days now in opening a new business. Licensing, which we have not gone far enough, and operations of firms. We need to improve the regulatory business environment, especially in terms of the implementation of measures. I've been working with the private sector for the last 3 years, and the delays are enormous. No investor can invest if you have such long delays because of regulatory bottlenecks. Promote e-governance and administrative reforms. Strengthen, of course, the public health system now. Promote digitalization in public, private, and social sectors now. And this can be done. We have the funding. And at the same time, provide clever incentives for greening of activities, for renewable energy and circular economy, especially in the agro, food, and tourist sectors. Even in traditional sectors, we need to improve value added and transform them. And last but not least, build consensus for reforms with long-term impact. These are education, judicial, and social benefit reforms. In Sweden, it took them 10 years to have an educational reform. We cannot have an educational reform every year. We need, I think, political parties need to agree on a long-term agenda for reforms which are critical, such as education reform, judicial reform, and social benefits reforms. Fourth step, policies, in my view, and from my professional experience, both in the public sector and the private sector, will never be implemented unless they are transformed into concrete and manageable projects. Policies are important, they set the environment, but unless you think of policies and you decompose them into a set of specific manageable projects, especially in Greece, they will never be implemented. For example, we all say, and it's a wish, let's fight tax evasion. Who does not agree? Very few. How do you do this? What actions are needed? Who is responsible? What key performance indicators do you put every day, every month? What is the time frame? We suggest, and we all agree that we need a red tape reduction for companies. Have you ever thought about how many ministries are involved in reducing red tape? Who is the project leader? Who monitors the needs and outcomes at the company level? How is the voice of companies heard in this process? So if we want policies to be implemented in a country such as Greece, which has a lot of common characteristics as in other emerging economies, even though it's a developed economy, many of its characteristics are those of an emerging economy. We need to think of projects for each policy area, identify projects implemented at the national, regional, and local levels. Is this something that the public sector can do? No, it needs close collaboration with the private sector, but the private sector at the local level, at the regional level, at the national level. And because we all talk about transformation and technological transformation, I would say, let's think of 3 to 5 emblematic investment projects in each region, even in traditional sectors. For example, thematic cultural parks. We don't have a single one in Greece. Assisted living housing complexes, now that aging is a big challenge. Thermal spas, we have natural wealth, which is better than most other European countries, yet they're totally underdeveloped. And it's not because the investors will not do them by themselves. Why not? Because there are all sorts of regulatory bottlenecks which prevent them from doing so. So it has to be done in close collaboration. So public and private sector at the local level need to collaborate to be able to implement a specific project, even in a traditional sector. Think of agricultural waste management, think of medical tourism, and so on. And for each project, let us set specific KPIs. What does this mean? That we need to reorganize the way the government works to be able to implement this kind of projects.
Thank you, Louka. Could we, I'm sorry, we're going to run out of time.
Okay, I'll go very fast. Effective implementation of policies and projects is the 5th step. We need to mature projects, to ensure the proper management, to anticipate the legal obstacles, and to build partnerships to safeguard sustainability. So let's forge PPPs. We have the funding, and we can use the Recovery and Resilience Fund to fund these, as well as financial instruments and innovative financial instruments, and to ensure local support for project implementation. 2 last steps, monitoring and evaluation. And Chris, that's where I would start from. In Greece, we don't know which policies have been implemented because there is no monitoring system. Monitoring system, the ministries, within the municipalities, nobody knows what has actually been implemented. So let's create an intra-ministerial network of policy antennas for monitoring and implementation. And let's think of an independent policy evaluation agency which actually monitors progress by project and policy outcomes and evaluate results. And last but not least, let's communicate outcomes to build trust and credibility and ownership. Ownership is an endogenous process. So we need to build it, and we need to communicate outcomes which are linked to vision, to strategy and policy choices. Highlighting alternatives, there is not a one way of doing things, and disseminating results. Can we do it? I think we can. Let's try it. Thank you.
So, shall I start, Kevin?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks very much to LSE, to the Hellenic Observatory, and my good friend Kevin from the National Council on Research and Technology for inviting me to comment on this interim Pissarides report. I want to correct a cute mistake made by Kevin, I'm at Goethe University, Frankfurt, not at Goethe Institute. Goethe Institute won't have me because of my imperfect German. I'm very happy to be here. Okay, so let me say that it's a difficult task to discuss the Pissarides report. You know, after a theory of everything, we have a policy for everything, and a discussion for everything is in 10 minutes is not possible. I have a lot of common background with the authors. We work together with on the Greek economists for reform, but I have had no involvement in the current report, so I can provide an outside and independent view, also based on my experiences at the National Council. There's a lot to like in what's being produced. There's a very broad range of policy issues based on research, has benefited from the experience with the fiscal crisis. It's an example of what a collaboration between Greek-based economists, Greek researchers, I would say more generally, and researchers based abroad can do. There are many fruitful and implementable recommendations, I feel. But I should also say that Pissarides cannot aspire to be Fauci nor Chiodras. And the problem is, you know, there's a difference between virology and economics. Tobin used to say that, you know, if you are a hard scientist, everybody takes you completely seriously. If you're an economist, everybody has an opinion and disagrees with you. So it's likely to lead to a debate, and that's healthy debate. And even lockdowns are debated for their economic consequences. So I'll present some of my own ideas and ask myself and Chris to what extent they're reflected in the report. So I agree that one very important key problem is the very low share of investment in total output. I would go further and I would say that actually what's going on here is that the private share of investment is the lowest in the EU, and the public share of investment is the highest in the EU. So we have very, very limited private involvement in investment, and we have a real problem in attracting inward foreign direct investment. So we were in 2018, we were actually the last in the EU in this respect. The second problem is the export portfolio. And I think I got the sense that Chris was talking more about economies of scale. And of course, these are very important. But I want to stress more, and I hope that we stress also the portfolio. So the variety of sectors, industries, types of services in which we are involved and where we aspire to export. We tend to have a very limited manufacturing sector, very limited manufacturing exports as a share of GDP. We tend to concentrate on low value added sectors. We tend to concentrate in services. I mean, if we are going to think also of tourism as an export type of activity, we tend to be very overly concentrated in services that are very sensitive to the ups and downs of the business cycle, and also stress presence, physical presence. And now with COVID, we realized that that's an issue as well. So we need to diversify our portfolio as much as possible to areas previously, unexplored for us. So the third problem, which is close to my heart and my research, and where I don't see much, I have to say, in what I've seen in the report, is, and it links a little bit also to Louka's comments, is household finances. So households, as a result of the fiscal crisis, as a result of the COVID crisis, as a result of the pathological problems that the Greek economy has, they face lots of risks. So they face retirement risks, longevity risks due to poor retirement systems and limited ability of Social Security and occupational pensions to deliver. There are problems with health insurance. There are problems, you also mentioned it, Chris, with the social programs. So they face lots of risks. And they have to, or they can, and they should, use the opportunities available in the financial sector, in the financial products, to manage these risks instead of being destroyed by them, not to be left behind. So just to give you an example, this is from the Household Finance and Consumption Survey, the activity at the ECB that I also advise, where we have participation rates for households in different financial products. And look at Greece, 90.4% of the population have deposits. And then you look at other things, mutual funds, bonds, stocks, voluntary pensions, saving for retirement in addition to what the system is going to provide. And you see numbers that, you have to have a magnifying glass to differentiate from zero. So it's only deposits. That's the only thing we understand. We do not make use of individual retirement accounts, for example, to save extra for retirement. We don't make use of the available instruments, mutual funds and the like. And that is going to hurt us, especially now that the European Union is really developing the Capital Markets Union, is internationalizing opportunities, not only for firms to get funds from abroad, but also for households to diversify their portfolios, to make use of internationally available and internationally diversified financial products. And we need to provide the financial literacy. We need to provide the means to households, the advice, the regulation, the supervision, so as to enable households to take advantage of these opportunities and prevent them from making very serious mistakes and being subject to financial misconduct and to be led to financial distress. And that's a sector where I think we need to do a lot going forward. And it does make a difference. So according to all the various indicators of wealth inequality rose during the fiscal crisis between 2010 and 2014 in Greece. And we know from research that the rich not only have more to invest, but they are able to earn better returns on their investments. And we need to empower households, we need to empower broader classes of households to take advantage of what is out there. A further issue that we have developed now in the fiscal crisis is what I call one-way mobility, the migration. There has been considerable migration during the fiscal crisis. They are young people, they are fed up, they are very likely to set up households abroad and very likely to not return. So we have to find ways to bring them back, to bring some of them back, but also, and here I'm in total agreement with the committee, to network people, Greeks abroad, Greeks of the diaspora, with Greeks in Greece. Key unexploited assets, a highly educated labor force, which is out of whack with the use that is being made. So we have a share of scientists and engineers, for example, that's disproportionately high relative to the share of R&D expenditure in GDP. We're not using these people. We're not channeling their talents to research and development. We have the diaspora, and I like very much that you emphasized both diaspora in industry and services abroad, and in academia and research centers. You know, part of the plan should be exactly how to connect these people using modern methods. We have online communications. We have teleworking possibilities now. We have, you know, project collaboration. We need to introduce the technical, the digital means, if you like, of collaboration. We have to introduce matchmaking platforms that you are very familiar from in, you know, labor, you know, from your work in labor, to extend them to these, you know, to this matchmaking between the diaspora and Greeks in Greece. I think this is a very underutilized resource. And third, we have Greek champions, and I believe the first speaker spoke about those as well. Greek champions in industry who do research and invest in their industry. We had the opportunity with Kevin to find out some great examples, and I'm not advertising anybody if I mention Creta Farms, for example, with a huge research budget that we had seen back then, and also you know, other initiatives with respect to organic foods, etc. And there is high potential for innovation. And there are also pockets of excellence in academic research in Greece in many different areas. So life sciences, for example, and biology. I mean, this was in medical sciences. Amazing things are happening there. But, you know, and the National Council had actually written, you know, done a survey and found out and cataloged these pockets of excellence. But the problem is, I don't know, we don't know how many of those survived the fiscal crisis. There will be a lot of scope for surveying the landscape now and seeing where, you know, there is the supply of research expertise that can be linked and connected to industry, that can be linked and connected to companies abroad. If you look at the World Economic Forum and the Global Competitiveness Index, you see that the innovation ecosystem, you know, we score low there, we score low on markets, we score very high on human capital, you know, both on health and in skills. We score high on enabling environment, infrastructure, etc. And I got the impression that the report is more focused on markets, which is extremely important, as we can see here. I would like very specific recommendations to be made on, you know, building these science parks, building these clusters like Coralia that exist, but also others, bringing people together, you know, in hubs, making them interact. And this is somewhere, you know, where Greeks are great at interaction, you know, at extrovert sort of behavior, joining forces to, especially the young people and startups, etc., to really make a difference and to build up this portfolio of products, of exportables, of goods and services. So key modern ways forward that I want to stress: promote financial literacy and financial health. Okay, so here there is a lot that can be done. I mentioned some of it. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, on financial advice, financial literacy, investor and borrower protection as an extra dimension beyond consumer protection. We have consumer protection, but investment and borrower protection is something that even Europe is now starting to discover, and we need to get there to avoid financial misconduct, you know, like the FCA, for example, in the UK, and enable people to take advantage of the capital markets union prospects. I want to mention and stress pan-European personal pension product. So that's going to be available by the end of 2021. That's going to allow people to move around in the European Union and to keep contributing to the same pension product in addition to whatever is available on the national level. These are things that people need to be aware of and take advantage of, both on the demand side and on the supply side. Financial industry can also be a supplier of such accounts. I want to say, overcome the fear of private initiatives and entrepreneurship. Profit seeking is a bad word in Greek. It's terrible that we have gotten ourselves in this situation. I want to push for something that we haven't been able to do yet, to distinguish between the obligation of the state to provide something like free university education and the monopoly of the state. The obligation of the state doesn't mean monopoly of the state. The UK has found solutions to many of its economic problems by building up a very vibrant university education with foreign students, etc. There is a prospect for public universities to do that. There should be prospect also for private universities to do that. And if we are concerned about selling degrees, or if we are concerned more broadly about private sector involvement in the public sphere, there is a way out of this. We introduce tough independent authorities where we are in doubt. We introduce, there exist international accreditation boards, there exist regulators, and we can introduce regulators also in coordination with the EU, not just for universities. Universities, I think, are a big thing, but also in other spheres. You mentioned research. You mentioned the Greek NSF. Our National Council had also proposed this. Two problems that we realized back then, because there's also no institutional memory. That's another problem that exists in Greece. Things don't accumulate. Each committee has to discover everything from scratch, and that's good, but that's also bad, and I think it's mostly bad. But two things that we discovered back then. One is the national government, the elected government, should really define the priorities for pushing research, because they have the electoral mandate, for applied research. You say, and I fully agree, basic research should be independent of all of that, and there should be continuity and going on. There is another problem, which is segmentation of research funding across ministries. And each ministry and each minister allocating research funds to various projects that serve this minister's political priorities, objectives, etc. And I think, and we thought as National Council back then, that there should be a separation. There should be a decision by the government on what are the national priorities for applied research to move forward. There should be a decision by researchers, by this NSF, to evaluate research projects and to say which are the better research projects and which are the worst ones, and also to maintain this continuity in basic research that researchers need. The last item here sounds very materialistic, but I would put it at a high rate: provide salary enhancement for active researchers. We are in a situation where my postdoc earns, in Germany, earns double the salary of a full professor in Greece. And that is unacceptable. You cannot really maintain, keep high quality devoted researchers to Greece, or it's much more difficult if you are doing that. But these projects can provide the salary enhancements and the incentives that go in the right direction. Connectivity within the country, you mentioned it, research, academia, and industry, the clusters I mentioned, improved connectivity with diaspora. And here, I want to say something where there are examples already in Greece, but more can be done to promote that, the participation in the international share economy, gig economy, etc. So enable, cultivate this idea that you don't, if you are a Greek company, you don't have to build the whole NASA spacecraft. You can bid to build a small, tiny part, which is a very high value added, a very expensive, a very specialized part, and where you can make the difference. So connecting, highly educated young entrepreneurs or Greek entrepreneurs with this international world, and doing that with state support and organizing framework, I think is going to be a very important way forward. And I shut up.
Thank you very much indeed to each of you. We are going to be running out of time, but I thank you for the quality of your presentations. I believe we can go a little bit further. Let me try to summarize many of the questions that have come in. We've had lots of questions, and I'm going to try to put them under thematic headings. And for this first question, perhaps I could ask each of you to answer, but briefly. There's a lot of questions about how do you get ownership? The critical point that Chris mentioned at the beginning, questions about who actually wants reform. Demetrius refers to a culture of resistance to reform. He refers to the well-known vested interests. George refers to buy-in requires trust, and trust requires credibility. Credibility comes from reform, but who actually wants it? Constantina, what is the biggest barrier to ownership? George, who is actually going to implement these proposals? So there's a whole set of questions there that have come in about how do you get the ownership. I understand Louka is talking about inclusivity and a social compensation and sustainability, etc. You can't ask for sacrifices without various means of sustainability and social support. But Chris, at the very beginning, you mentioned the problem was ownership. Well, yes, presumably this is where Greece entered the situation decades ago.
Would you like me to start, or Louka?
Yes.
Yeah, me. Okay.
I'm sorry, Chris, if you could respond. You say ownership is the key, but
yeah.
How do we get ownership?
Yeah. Well, first let me say it's not immediate. It's not completely straightforward. I can't say to you this is how you get it and you get it, but it is possible to get it. Ownership of reform means that those who are carrying out the reform believe that it will be for their own good as well as for the good of the country. So it has to start at the top by the government. The government has to believe entirely that that the reforms that they are doing 5 years from now, if they, or whenever they are no longer in power, they will look back and they will be proud that they've done them because it was good for the country, it was good for them as a government. So that's number one. And I do believe from things the government said, both in public and private and all that, they do believe, the first time I was struck by the ownership of reforms in Greece, in fact, was 2 years before the election of last year at the Delphi Economic Forum when Kyriakos Mitsotakis was interviewed by the Stanford historian. I'm sure you know him.
Niall Ferguson from Harvard.
Exactly. I think he was at Harvard then, but he's at Stanford now, isn't he? The Hoover Institution, or vice versa. Anyway, we know this. And that's what he insisted. He insisted it's ownership reforms. And if Kyriakos Mitsotakis was saying, wasn't there, I can see that's good for the country, and that's why I'm going to do it. Now, I mean, we had one example an hour ago, you know, when Mr. Apostolopoulos spoke about our reforms representing Greek entrepreneurs. He sounded that he was more than happy to own the reforms that we're suggesting, the Greek business environment. The others, they would own them, you know, take the reforms we're making about women coming into the labor force. We're introducing preschool childcare with education for their children, those who have them, and we're introducing paternity leave for men to go there. Women will feel that they're better off under this regime. I was surprised, in fact, this was also in the interim report. I was surprised by how little the Greek press took it up. I think there were only one or two articles written by women saying that this might be the biggest legacy that this interim report will leave, that for the first time ever, someone is addressing Greece the question of complete equality and engaging women. That's what we mean by ownership. You know, there is a reform in the education system, there is a reform in social support, and those who are involved, in this case, women of working age, believe that it's good for them because it will give them more flexibility in going out into the labor market. Therefore, they will own these
yes.
Now
I can understand that from a reform package, you can get winners from reform and you can gain support from it. But Chris, one quick follow-up. You talk about complementarities. There's also a different type of complementarity in the Greek system of interconnecting interests that block reform. When you talk about courts, judicial reform, educational reform, reform of the public administration, these are reforms that have been aspirations for a decade or more. I think one of the questions had come in to say, what's the difference of the reforms you're advocating here from the agendas of the Simitis government or the Yorgos Papandreou government? So these reforms hadn't happened because of complementarities that block the reform, vested interests. You might be able to get winners from certain social benefits or whatever, but there are deeper complementarities that mitigate against reform.
Well, ultimately, well, of course, you know, there is no such thing as Pareto improvement, to use the economic term, which is defined by saying no one will be made worse off and many people will. But those who will be made worse off will be the rent seekers. There will be those who are enjoying some kind of special status, however they manage to get it. You have to start from the simpler reforms to implement the ones that give an immediate gain. In fact, Louka even made that same point, actually, as well, like directly or indirectly. Start from there, you start seeing the benefits. The point about Greece is that the majority is not gaining currently from the current situation. In fact, far from it, they're losers. And we live in a democracy, ultimately. If the majority realize that they want to own the reform, they want to carry them out, they see some early results from things that are easy to implement, then they will join in, and it will be very, very hard for some institution, be it trade union or employers association or professional group, to block it all. In the face of that, the government, of course, has a lot of leeway to twist arms, carrots or sticks, and that's how it happens. You know, I'm not recommending a Thatcher approach. I lived through it. I don't like it. You know, where she said there's no alternative, I'm going to do it, and hard luck. No, this is not the way to reform.
Okay, Louka.
Let me start by saying that every reform and every policy has gainers and losers. Now, nobody is convinced a priori that the reform will be good and will serve the public interest, especially in an atmosphere where there is distrust You really need to convince people that any single policy or any single reform is it serves the public interest. So to do so, the first thing is to actually think about the consequence of that reform, communicate the fact that there will be losers and there will be gainers, identify them if needed, and then implement it so that then the outcomes can be related to the design. What we see here, we talk about reforms, but we don't do this analysis per reform as to who gains, who loses, what are the compensate losers if you can, and go on. Let me give you an example. From Michalis mentioned in terms of the actual very low share of bonds and mutual funds, etc. in Greek. Well, the PSI, for example, which was initiated, actually people lost in one night 50% of their wealth in one night, and they were not compensated. Now, I'm asking you, who is going to withhold a Greek bond now? So when you build distrust, you cannot own reserve. We need to go back. Step one, start building trust and confidence in the Greek society, and we can do that only with concrete actions and very frank discussion and an open dialogue as to who gains, who loses, and what compensatory measures need to be taken.
If I may just follow up.
Yeah.
Sorry, Chris.
Yeah.
If I could just follow up with Louka. I wonder, is this a situation, though, where the winners are long-term and the gains are evenly spread, but the losers are now and big?
Well, there is a time dimension, which is very often the case. There is kind of, well, there are many different dimensions. There are dimensions, kind of interpersonal dimension. There are interclass dimension. There are intergenerational dimension, and there is a time dimension. So the thing is, for every reform, there needs to be an analysis of all these dimensions, a clear explanation to people as to why you do it, what you want to achieve, what are the expected results, when does it serve the public interest or not, and so on. And it's a struggle, it's a political game. But I get very angry when I hear, especially after the austerity measures of 10 years, people saying governments of all political classes did not own these reforms. Especially it's the case when some of these reforms are also imposed from outside. You have the creditors who forced the actual implementation of specific reforms, and this did tremendous damage to the reform movement. I'm a pro-reformist, but there is nothing worse than having ill-designed reforms imposed by outsiders many a times and inflicted upon people who had nothing to, who had no voice. And we really, when we start again, we should take these into considerations and start from scratch, you know, step after step, building confidence and trust again in the government. There is no trust in the government, in any government or in political institutions. And I think we will find, unless we bridge that gap, we will have it, we will see it as a problem of democracy.
Thank you. Chris, please.
Kevin?
Chris, yes.
Actually, I'd like to say, I should have said it before in response to Louka. I agree with practically with everything she said. Actually, I can hardly find anything to disagree in her commentary. And I mean, I'm surprised she's saying that. She just said that she's getting very angry when people are saying it's because of the ownership of reforms. I mean, like during the austerity was completely wrong approach of following it. You know, like when Schäuble was in Germany. I spoke many times, both in Greece and Britain and Brussels and Davos Economic Forum, openly against policy of austerity. I was saying there is no way you can get reforms through when there is austerity, and made proposals about allowing the debt to go further up. The European Central Bank should be inflating up to 3 or 4% inflation and all that. But at the same time, there were structural reforms taking place. We can see them now. You know, we can see the legislation that was passed in the period 2012 to 2000. Some
was very good.
Yes. But that's the part that the Prime Minister said, I don't like these reforms. You know, like reforming the civil service, for example, to introduce evaluations. You know, like in Cyprus, it's impossible to get evaluations of civil servants' performance. The trade union says we are going to go on strike, and the whole of Nicosia will stall. And governments are scared to do it. In Greece, they did it, but at least say that's a good thing for the civil service. Not say I don't like it, but I'm going to do it anyway.
But let me put it this way: any single reform might be good, and you might even build a consensus around one, but that does not mean that every single reform can be owned.
Oh, I agree. No, I didn't say everything. Nothing is everything.
Managing reforms is one of the toughest things to do.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
it needs very great care to isolate the consequences of a reform, highlight them, and talk frankly with people as to who are the gainers and who are the losers.
Okay. Michele, if I could just add to what has been said, a number of the questions that came in seem to suggest that the reform agenda was back to Simitis, was back to Yorgos Papandreou, etc. We seem to be back to 2009, but this time bottom up without the Troika.
Yeah, so look, I think, you know, there have been lots of announcements, lots of plans, even lots of decisions, you know, parliamentary decisions and votes which have not been implemented. Okay, I think, you know, this ownership thing, it's very important. I think with the fiscal crisis, a key problem was the sequencing of reforms, that the labor reforms, the labor market reforms came before the product market reforms. The wages fell, the prices stayed high. People, it was difficult for people to, you know, to accept this. But you know, I have a lot of difficulty in looking at plans like these, and even plans that were constructed before, and saying, okay, how am I going to sell this? What's so difficult to sell? We are, you know, if the message is we are going to create jobs, we are going to build up, you know, a whole portfolio of industries, we are going to generate demanded jobs out of exports, we are going to connect you internationally with, you know, diaspora, with opportunities. You know, we are going to put you at the cutting edge of technology and digitalization. We are going to allow you to partake of what's going on around us. What is difficult to sell there? You mentioned, you know, Yorgos Papandreou. Yorgos Papandreou came, you know, relatively recently, a few years ago, after he was not prime minister. After he stepped down, and I asked him, you know, how come you didn't make it easier for businesses to run, and for you know, during your stay? I mean, what's so difficult about it? And he said that, you know, part of the problem was coordination among ministries. You know, that nobody. It was a ministry ownership problem. It was that, you know. The power was segmented, and it was very difficult for everything to come together and to deliver, you know, the final results. Louka mentioned and sort of challenged me a little bit, but I agree with her on, you know, the PSI and the bonds. I'll tell you, we have the lowest stock market participation because so many people got burned in 2000 in Greece. And the whole rhetoric was governments or others manipulate the stock market, and there is no trust. I mean, you mentioned it. I think you both mentioned it. There is no trust in this. Okay, so we have to work around that. We have to overcome that. I mean, there is even academic research, a lot of academic research showing that past experiences with the stock market, etc., influence participation. But here we have the opportunity to open up these portfolios, right? To go to internationally diversified portfolios, not just to Greek stocks, to participate in pension products that are international and internationally diversified, to insurance policies, etc. If we don't explain this to people, if we don't make it easy for them to participate, we do not build knowledge, we do not build trust, and in the end, they don't take these opportunities. So maybe, back to your question, Kevin, maybe the time has come now, after all of these bad experiences, right? And the disappointments and the pressure and everything, to go forward with a campaign. I mean, we need a campaign. Maggie Thatcher, Chris doesn't like her. I didn't like her very much either when I was an undergraduate in the UK. But she educated people to buy stocks in privatized utilities. And the participation rate jumped from 8% to 22% just because of Thatcher, who had her political motives. Also, she wanted to turn workers into capitalists. That's another story. But you know, you can do really major, you can have major effects through financial literacy and information and campaigns.
Okay, thank you. I was almost optimistic until you mentioned Margaret Thatcher. There's some specific questions, and I'll invite any of you to answer these. But I guess this one goes to the heart of the immediate strategy. A question from our friend Miranda Xafa. How do you create the fiscal space needed to cut taxes and pension contributions, and at the same time provide basic public services that are being squeezed unsustainably, as in health or other services? Can I invite any of you to respond to that?
Well, I guess I have to respond to it because I kept saying this to that. I mean, it's a big question, but remember though that there are lots of funds being made available by the EU to get this reform program started. There is going to be economic growth after the reform program, and there is a lot of waste in Greek hospitals and schools and public service, which in the past, again, a policy that was dead against it when it was happening, where they thought that the way to achieve fiscal austerity or fiscal balance was by cutting wages and pensions, which of course reduced demand, and then it led you to a downward spiral, instead of emphasizing economies at the public institution, which is what Britain actually has been championing economizing. We do have, I mean, I didn't do it because I don't have the local Greek knowledge required to write any report, but we do have proposals how to do the budget. I mean, it's not something that escaped us. There's an equation called the budget balance equation in all economic models that should be taken into account. But to get us started, though, it's the EU funds. Without the EU funds, I don't think we can do anything more. And there's at least 32 billion euros, possibly more. I saw one person actually writing in the Q&A, in the end, it's going to be much less than 32 billion euros. I don't think so, actually. I don't know how they got that idea. In fact, currently Greece has proposals for more than 32 billion, and currently what the government is doing is to set priorities and submit a proposal that takes in all money.
Louka.
Let me say that it's the first, in terms of before cutting taxes, which need to be cut, you need to expand the tax base. And that comes back to the question that I raised. How do you do that? And how do you fight tax evasion, especially under conditions of stress? And I think this should be actually one, because no matter how much you cut down expenditures are not very high. There are new needs which demand public expenditures, including public investment. So we really need to work on the tax side, on tax evasion. There, first of all, certainty or uncertainty is extremely important. You cannot change tax laws annually and expect people to pay them. Secondly, we need to really start from the beginning and have a tax law which can be explained to people and to investors. It's extremely cumbersome and it leaves a lot of room for kind of explanations as to what the tax law says. So I would agree with Chris that tax reform in terms of simplicity of the tax and fighting tax evasion and creating the right incentives is actually it's a precondition for any sustainable plan.
Michele?
No, I agree with that. I mean, I think if the plan is successful in building up industry, right, the private sector, in generating incomes, then taxes will, tax revenues will come with it as well. So, and I'm sure that the committee has done good work on identifying the particular, specific measures that are going to be implemented. I don't know. I have to say, I got from Euronews 2 hours ago, I got a message, Hungary and Poland block EU's COVID-19 recovery package over a new rule of law drive. So there will be political problems. Don't, Chris is assuming that everything is coming, but it's not a done deal. And we will have to see how things will develop. Yeah.
And Kevin, if
can I just insert that, because this gives the opportunity of asking one of the other questions that came in, which was precisely to be skeptical about when and what may come from the European Union in terms of funding, the uncertainty in terms of the timing and how big that funding might be for Greece. But there's also a different question which has been raised about the capacity of Greek public institutions to bid for and absorb such funding. You've all spoken about the low quality of public institutions and low quality governance, needs for public administration reform. But do you think the administration is adequate to be able to absorb and deploy such funding effectively? I wonder, Louka, if we could start with you on that.
Yeah, let me say that they're not. And it's not only the government, it's actually local communities and so on. And what I'm afraid is that even if the funds are secured, the countries which will get them, it's on a competitive basis. You need to actually put forward investment projects which are green, which are clever, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what I'm afraid, and I hope in 1 year or 2 years we are not here again discussing the same things, is that the government will ask ministries to present projects, and we will have quote unquote traditional projects which are in the pipeline of ministries coming up. So the first question is, what is the process by which project generation takes place? Secondly, how innovative are these and how do they serve a transformation agenda? Third, why not link with people who have experience from the private sector in terms of project selection and from the regional level, from academia, from people in the consultants. I would put in consultants who have been working with the private sector and who know much better what the problems are. I've been working in the culture sector now for the last year almost. Now, even in the culture sector, you have a need for digitalization, for new platforms, et cetera, et cetera. Now, where can one voice these suggestions? So we really need to think, if we want to have good projects being proposed, we need to manage this process so that projects are come up, are matured, and can be presented. And I'm afraid that, once again, the governance of the process is extremely low quality. And to be frank with you, when the Pissarides committee was formed, I thought that this was their main mandate, to actually open up and generate projects, but it's not, okay? And we will go back, unless we open up and we manage this process in an innovative way, we will go back to the old projects, which will not probably, we had other programs as well, and we have the same problem. And let me say something which is not known. We have programs going on with the community structural funds that go on for 2 years, 3 years, and nobody monitors the fact that even though you have the funding, it's there, they are not implemented. In the agricultural sector, for 2 years now, there is the platform through which the agricultural industry can finance investment is not working, and nobody monitors this. So one question is, what projects will be proposed? The second, who are these projects, how innovative they are, and will they be implemented or not?
Yeah, thank you. Chris, I wonder if I could go to another question. It says,
you don't want me to respond? You don't want me to respond to that?
Oh, please, yes, but we're going to run out of time very soon. But please, yes.
Very quickly, I changed the tense a little bit of Louka. Louka said they cannot. I said in the past they couldn't absorb those that kind of money, the ministries, but I know, and we're an independent committee. Of course, I don't know how Louka got the idea that we're going to actually tell them how to get the money, because those are political decisions on what projects you actually choose. But the report we're presenting, which is about 280 pages, has everything under the sun in there, if you like, and the government would make a selection on the basis of its political priorities. We're not going to tell them how to do that. But what I do know is awareness that in the past Greece has failed to absorb all the money was available. There is great need for this money, and the government has been deliberating and discussing through a very well organizational structure, which has been approved, as far as I know, by the European Union in selecting the projects that meet all the objectives that the European Union has set to claim the money. Now, the only thing I can say, therefore, is to reserve judgment at least. Don't prejudge it now by saying they are not going to do it. How do we know? You emphasize so many uncertainties in the past, and that's the only thing you're certain.
Can I answer this? Because I've been in this business for too long.
Yes, but given how fond you are of all the uncertainties we've been facing, but something you are not uncertain.
Because being in business for too long, there are preconditions for implementation, and these preconditions are not in existence. They are not there. That's what I'm afraid of, and I hope I'm wrong, but they are not there. I don't see the steps that need to be taken so that even if the funding comes, this goes where it should go.
That's because they're doing it intelligently. They're not telling everyone what they're doing, because then the whole press will come out and there will be confusion.
That might be
Okay. But Chris, on that, in this 200+ page report, are you giving guidance to governments as to how to select the priority projects?
Yes, of course, yeah. At the end.
At the end, okay. We'll stay for the finale.
I mean, how to select in the sense of the complementarities involved, the sequencing of reforms, what's important in that sense. But of course, we are not, as an independent committee, we're not going to tell the government, do this and don't do the other. And we're also, each section, if you like, of a reform has a first part that says what's wrong with the situation now, has a second part, what are our proposals, and has a third part, where is it going? And actually, Louka mentioned that you have to have a vision. In fact, we have a chapter on our vision of reform. which wasn't there in the interim report. I have to say it was subsequently for the final report. No, that's why I'm saying I agree entirely with what Louka had been saying in her commentary until she turned political a few minutes ago. And that's the only thing I don't agree with her. And even there is because I say reserve judgment, have some certainty. Don't be so certain.
This is not political.
Okay.
Political, it's a governance issue.
But, you know, speaking...
Absolutely, Louka, I was about to say we need to finish, but at the beginning of the discussion, I feared that there would be so much economics I wouldn't understand it. At the conclusion of the discussion, I realized that political science is actually center stage to so much of this agenda. We've gone well over time, and I think the questions and the discussion has been great. Before I give my thanks, can I just mention a couple of things? The next public events online for the Hellenic Observatory will be a panel discussion with Joachim Almunia on his report on the lessons to be learned from the third Greek bailout. And this will be a panel discussion with Professor Ian Begg, Gikas Hardouvelis, and Elena Panaritis. So do join us for that discussion, which is on the 25th of November at 1600 UK time, lessons to be learned from the third Greek bailout. But in closing, let me repeat my thanks and the thanks of all of us at the Observatory to the Hellenic Entrepreneurs Association and its president, Vasilis Apostolopoulos. Thank you to the many people who've joined and for the questions. I apologize, I was not able to select so many of the questions that came in. But in concluding, let me give my very warm thanks to each of our speakers for their contributions and for a very informative discussion. Do please join us for the next online event, and you can get the information on the LSE Hellenic Observatory website. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good night.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
Kevin.
Thank you.